The return signal arrived at 3:14 shipboard, and I almost missed it. 11 days, 4 hours, and something like 30 minutes. That was how long the probe had been transmitting into the dark on the Vaethari frequency range. Our intelligence package had reconstructed from 3 centuries of stray intercepts and 3 decades of active analysis. 11 days of broadcasting in a language we were 60% certain they could parse, carrying the orbital mechanics of our home system, the spectral signature of our sun, a prime number progression, and a single looping image. A human hand, open-palmed. The universal gesture of the empty hand. The oldest signal any social species could think to send. For 11 days, nothing had come back. I was Senior Specialist Marin Voss, Primary Signals and Sensor Integration, Second Watch, aboard the Terran Dreadnought Ardent Silence. I had been in that post for 6 years, 4 months, and what was now going to be a number of days I would spend the rest of my life recounting. My station was aft of the main sensor array in combat information, a room that smelled permanently of recycled air and the particular kind of human stress that coffee cannot fix. 4 other specialists shared the watch with me. We had been running completely silent for 31 days. Silent in fleet terms meant something specific aboard the Ardent Silence. No active sensor emissions, no radio, no drive exhaust above 0.03% thrust. The ship's passive arrays were alive, drinking in every photon, every particle cascade, every gravitational whisper the Kalen Rift had to offer, but we were putting nothing out. We were reading the universe, not speaking to it. The Kalen Rift was a nebula of the old, slow-cooling variety, not a nursery, a graveyard. Stars that had burned out long enough ago that the gas they'd shed on their way out had spread to a density that did 3 things for us. It scattered active sensors to near uselessness, beyond 40,000 kilometers. It provided thermal cover for a vessel our size running cold, and it lit up in false color on a visual display in a way that would have been beautiful if any of us had felt like being moved by something beautiful. A smear of deep amber and gray-blue across the forward screens. The conclave survey elements were somewhere inside it, 14 light-minutes away, doing to the probe what we were doing to them. Watching, measuring, deciding what to make of us. The probe was a diplomatic platform. That is the clinical description. In plain terms, it was a cylinder 3 meters long and 2 meters wide, loaded with transmitters and a small reactor, deployed from the Ardent Silence's launch bay 22 days earlier. It carried no weapons. It carried no propulsion beyond attitude control. It was, by design, helpless, the clearest signal we knew how to send that the thing making first contact was not a threat. The probe was the ambassador. The Ardent Silence was the thing standing behind the ambassador, saying nothing. We had 3 Vaethari survey vessels at 14 light-minutes when I came on watch. That number had grown to 7 over the preceding 3 days, in increments so measured and regular that I had begun to think of them the way you think of a tide. Predictable, patient, entirely indifferent to the fact that you are watching. The Vaethari Conclave was not an empire. Our intelligence package was careful about that word. Empire implied centralized violence as a governing instrument, and the Conclave's internal communications traffic, what little we had decoded, suggested something more like a parliamentary body that had survived long enough to become an institution the member species viewed as inevitable. 11 species, hundreds of inhabited systems, 3,000 years of documented continuous function, which meant they had been voting on things and arguing about procedural rules when humanity was still scratching marks into cave walls. They were old, they were careful, and they had seen new species before. That was the intelligence assessment that sat in the back of my head for 31 days. The Vaethari Conclave had a standard protocol for first contact. It was documented. They had published it, or rather, they had transmitted it on a frequency they knew other species monitored, which amounted to the same thing. Step 1. Passive observation. Step 2. A survey element moves to observe the new signal source at close range. Step 3. The Conclave diplomatic delegation transmits a formal acknowledgement. Step 4. A waiting period of no fewer than 40 Vaethari rotational periods, roughly 11 of our days before further contact, to allow the new species time to respond or to flee. Step 5. If no hostile action occurred in that window, the Conclave considered the contact formally open. We were at the end of Step 4 when the return signal arrived. I caught it because of a pattern anomaly on the low-band passive array, a modulation I had not seen before in 11 days of watching their signals traffic. It was directed at the probe. I had the computer decode the encoding header in about 4 seconds, cross-reference the frequency against the known Vaethari diplomatic band in another 2, and flag it for priority processing in the third. I put it on the main feed and keyed the command deck. CIC to command. We have a return signal on the diplomatic band, directed at the probe, decoding now. Commander Tal Irevan, XO of the Ardent Silence, was on the command deck. I heard her chair adjust. How long to full decode? 90 seconds, maybe 120. Their encoding is layered. Copy. Captain Orav is being woken. Stand by. I stood by. The first layer of the signal was structural header data that matched the Conclave's documented diplomatic contact protocol almost exactly. Formal acknowledgement of the probe, notation of the transmission period, a date stamp in their own calendar, which our translation system flagged as roughly equivalent to the current date. They were saying this was a current, active communication, not a pre-recorded archive. The second layer was linguistic, running in the same reconstructed frequency pattern we had used in the probe's transmissions, which meant they had received our signal, analyzed our encoding, and were choosing to reply in something close to what we had sent. Not identical, they were correcting our grammar in real time, which was either helpful or slightly pointed, and I chose to read it as helpful. The third layer took longer. It was dense with cross-reference indexing. Each statement in the body of the message linked back to a documentation set that our translation system could only partially decode. Those links were, as far as I could tell, citations. The Conclave was footnoting their own communication with references to their contact protocol database, which meant this message had been checked against 3,000 years of procedural precedent before it was sent. Every word they were about to say to us had been reviewed against every word they had ever said in a first contact before. When it resolved, I read it 3 times before I said anything. Captain Kira Orav arrived on the command deck as I was reading it the second time. I heard her footsteps. She walked fast, always, a habit that had taken new crew members a week to stop interpreting as urgency. I keyed the feed to the main deck display and put the translation on screen. The message from the Vaethari Conclave read, in the closest approximation our translation system could produce. We have received your signal. We have observed your platform for the required period. We note that your platform is the extent of your presence at this location. We are prepared to conduct formal contact with the sending species. We are moving survey elements to inspect your platform at close proximity. This is our standard procedure and is not hostile in intent. We ask that your sending species make no response that could be interpreted as aggression during the inspection period. We look forward to a productive relationship. Captain Orav read it once and said, "How many are we at now?" 7 survey elements, I said, spread across a 40,000-kilometer arc, 14 light minutes out. They have been advancing at a consistent rate of about 0.1% of the speed of light. At that rate, they will be at the probe in approximately 6 hours and 40 minutes. They're boxing it, Commander Irevan said. She was standing next to the tactical display, reading the plot. Look at the spacing. 7 ships in a 40,000-kilometer arc advancing on a fixed point. They're going to bracket it. That matches the documented protocol, I said. Close inspection by survey elements precedes the formal delegation's arrival. Irevan looked at the captain, or they're testing whether we run. Orav said nothing for a moment. She looked at the plot, at the 7 blips moving in that measured, inevitable way, and then she looked at me. How long has it been since any of our emissions could have reached them? Last detectable emission from this position would have been at pre-transit drift 31 days ago. At their survey element speed, they could have sent a vessel to our last position and found nothing there. As far as their sensor picture is concerned, that probe is alone. Good, the captain sat down. Let them inspect it. We observe and we do not move. That was the order. We did not move. The next 6 hours and 22 minutes were the longest of my professional life. I want to say that because it is true, not because it is dramatic. 6 hours and 22 minutes during which 7 alien vessels proceeded at a carefully considered pace toward a human diplomatic probe that had no defenses and no ability to run, while the ship I served on held its position in the dark and watched through passive arrays that could not act and could not respond. We were the best military technology humanity had ever built, crewed by people who had trained for years to operate it, and we were holding ourselves utterly still inside a nebula and watching a situation develop that we could not control. That is the job in its honest form. You hold still and you watch, and you trust that the people who designed the situation knew what they were doing. The probe's transmitters were on continuous loop, the same package we had originally sent, repeating in a 40-minute cycle, prime numbers, orbital mechanics, the spectral signature of our sun, the open palm. As the conclave survey elements advanced, their scan emissions began to appear on our passive arrays, a rolling front of active sensor pulses moving ahead of the ships, feeling out the space before them. Standard procedure for a survey element operating in a nebula environment. Nothing about it was aggressive. Everything about it was methodical. I watched those sensor pulses on my display for hours. They had a rhythm to them, a pattern in the intervals between sweeps that, once I recognized it, I could not stop noticing. The Vaethari were not sweeping randomly. Each sweep was offset from the last by a precise angular increment, building up a 3-dimensional composite picture of the space ahead of them. It was the work of a culture that had been doing this long enough to have developed, tested, and standardized the most efficient method for learning a new environment before entering it. My colleague on the adjacent console, Specialist Third Class Darren Halst, had been watching the same display. At the 3-hour mark he said, quietly enough that only I would hear, "They're good at this." 3,000 years of practice, I said. Do you think they're scared? I thought about it. I think they're careful. I'm not sure those are the same thing for them. Halst looked at the display. What about us? I did not answer that. The honest answer was that the people in that room were running on the compressed alertness that comes from long hours and high stakes, and the knowledge that the thing you have been training for is now happening, and whether that state is fear or its functional opposite is a question you can only answer after the fact, from a distance. In the moment, it just feels like being very awake. At 4 hours and 11 minutes into the watch period, I logged a new development. 3 additional Vaethari vessels had appeared at the edge of our passive array range. Not survey elements. The configuration was different. Larger cross-sections. Different emission signatures, running something that our intelligence package flagged as consistent with Conclave diplomatic class vessels. Heavier hulls, more active communications antenna arrays, drive signatures that matched long-range transports rather than fast survey craft. The diplomatic delegation was coming. They meant what they said, Irevan observed, looking at my display. They're not waiting to inspect the probe first. They sent the delegation before the inspection concluded. Could mean they've already decided, the captain said. Decided what? That this is worth their time. The survey elements reached the probe at the 5-hour and 40-minute mark. Their approach had been so slow, so precise, that watching them on the sensor display felt like watching a geometric proof unfold step by step, axiom by axiom, arriving at a conclusion that the mathematician already knew was coming. They took positions at distances ranging from 1,800 kilometers to 6,000 kilometers, spread evenly around the probe in 3 dimensions. Then they stopped. They ran their scans for 43 minutes. I watched the scan returns bounce off the probe and come back to them. I watched them cross-correlate. I knew what they were finding: a 3-meter cylinder, 2-meter diameter, non-ferrous hull, reactor signature consistent with civilian-grade power generation, no weapon systems, no propulsion capability above station keeping. It was, in every measurable way, exactly what it appeared to be: a signal platform and nothing else. The scan runs completed. The survey elements held position. Their active emissions dropped to a maintenance level. They were waiting. Then the diplomatic delegation closed the last 4,000 kilometers and came to rest at a distance of 22,000 kilometers from the probe. 3 vessels. The largest was, by my estimate, approximately 300 meters from bow to stern, not small, for a diplomatic ship. Its emissions profile was now loud and clear on our passive arrays. It was broadcasting on the diplomatic band. The message was addressed to the sending species of the platform. It was translated. The Vaethari Conclave recognizes the platform designated by the prime number sequence from our transmission as the representative instrument of a previously uncatalogued species. Consistent with our standard contact protocol, we have conducted a physical inspection of the platform and found it to be non-armed and non-propulsive. We read this as a deliberate statement of non-aggressive intent. We note that no vessel of the sending species is present at this location. We interpret this as a further statement of peaceful intent. The sending species has chosen to be represented only by its message and not by its force. We find this appropriate and consistent with the beginning of a productive contact. We invite a formal response from the sending species to be directed to the coordinates of this delegation. I read it once. Then I said, quietly, to no one in particular, "They think the probe is the extent of our presence." No one answered for a moment. Commander Irevan spoke first. "They think they're talking to a species that can build an interstellar transmission platform, but does not yet have a vessel capable of attending in person." "That's consistent with their contact history," I said. "They've encountered at least 2 species whose first contact signature was a transmission probe with no accompanying vessel. Both times the species in question didn't have the drive technology to attend. They're pattern matching." "They're not wrong too," the captain said. "It's a reasonable inference." "It's the wrong one." Orev said nothing for a moment. She looked at the tactical display. On it, the 3 Vaethari diplomatic vessels sat at 22,000 kilometers from the probe, surrounded by their 7 survey element escorts, and on the other side of the display, invisible to them, the ardent silence sat in the dark of the Kalen rift, and the distance between us and them was a number that would resolve in light minutes. The captain looked at Irevan. Irevan looked at the captain. "If we respond through the probe," Irevan said, "and they never learn we were here, we've established a relationship based on a fundamental misrepresentation of what we are." "Yes. That's not a relationship, that's a performance." "No," the captain's voice was flat but not cold. "That's a decision point." I kept my eyes on my displays, because that is what you do when the people above your rank are making a decision that will be discussed at institutional levels for the rest of your career. You do your job, and you give them the most accurate picture you can, and you do not volunteer opinions that were not requested. Orev stood up. She walked to the center of the command deck and looked at the overhead, the way some captains do when they are organizing a thought that they intend to speak only once. Then she looked at Irevan. "They've been conducting first contact protocols for 3,000 years, she said. "They have a documented procedure. They follow it. They're good at it. And right now they're looking at a probe and they're concluding that the species that sent it is not here in any form that could constitute a presence. Yes, Orevan said. That conclusion is going to shape every assumption they make going forward. What humanity is, what humanity is capable of, what they need to account for, and what they don't. Yes, I don't want them to have wrong assumptions. There was a silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds. On the tactical display, the Vaethari delegation sat at 22,000 kilometers. On my passive arrays, their diplomatic band transmission was still live, the invitation open and waiting. Commander Irevan said, "What are your orders, Captain?" Orev said, "Navigation, give me maneuvering thrust 5%. Heading, bearing 004, declination +11, direct intercept to the Vaethari diplomatic element. Chief Hollander, spin up the primary sensor array to full active. Voss, I want every passive signature we've been collecting for 31 days compressed into a transmission package and ready to go out on the Vaethari diplomatic frequency the moment we're in their sensor range. And I want our IFF broadcasting on all bands." I was already moving. IFF on all bands, preparing the passive data package. "One more thing," the captain paused. "Running lights on, full illumination of the hull, I want them to see us clearly." The ardent silence had been dark for 31 days. It came alive. There is a particular sound that a dreadnought makes when it shifts from silent running to active operation. Not a single sound, but a sequence of them, each one the result of a system that had been held in restraint letting go of that restraint and doing what it was designed to do. The passive arrays that had been running at minimal power stepped up to full gain. The primary sensor emitter, a system capable of resolving a half-meter object at 600,000 kilometers, cycled through its warm-up sequence in 40 seconds and painted the space ahead of us with a sweep that would have been visible on any Vaethari sensor bored as a lighthouse in a dark field. Our reactor, which had been running at 14%, stepped up in smooth increments toward full power. The drive nacelles, 2 of them, each one capable of sustaining thrust that would have been a significant fraction of the total output of the probe's reactor, began to breathe. And the running lights came on. A dreadnought of the Ardent Silences class was 940 meters from bow to stern. Her beam at the widest point was 260 meters. She had been designed, in the way that all Terran warships of her generation had been designed, not merely to be capable but to be visible, to have a presence that communicated at the sensor level and the visual level simultaneously, a single clear message. She was not elegant. She was not sleek. She was a structure of enforced geometric mass, angular and dense, with hull plating that carried the marks of every exercise engagement, and every actual engagement she had ever been through, panel lines and weld seams, and the dark staining along the flanks of the forward gun mounts, where the thermal bloom of her main armament had left its signature on her own hull. She had been in service for 19 years. She looked like it. With her running lights on and her active arrays broadcasting, she was a star. Not metaphorically, at the distance between us and the Vaethari diplomatic element, our initial sensor ping and the light from our running light arrays would reach them at effectively the same moment, given the light speed delay. What they would see, approximately 12 minutes from the moment we lit up, was a sensor contact that had not existed a moment before, appearing at a range that their survey elements should have detected at any point in the preceding 31 days, and had not, accompanied by the visual return of a vessel whose running light profile at 940 meters was not something you would mistake for anything small. We closed the distance at 5% thrust. At that acceleration and that distance, we would reach the Vaethari diplomatic element in approximately 4 hours. Captain Orev set a course that would bring us to a final position of 800 meters off the port bow of the lead diplomatic vessel, close enough to be unmistakable, far enough to be clearly not an attack approach. 800 meters, for a 940-meter ship, put our bow approximately 200 meters past their observation point, close enough to count our viewports. I transmitted the diplomatic contact package on the Vaethari frequency the moment our sensor ping would have reached them. The package contained the full transmission log from the probe, including every message we had sent and every message they had sent in response. A complete passive sensor record of our observation of their approach, every position, every heading, every emission signature we had logged over 31 days. A timeline demonstrating that we had been present at this location for the full duration of their contact protocol. And a translation, in the closest approximation of their documented linguistic structure our systems could produce, of a single sentence. We were here the entire time. We chose not to be seen. We are choosing to be seen now. Then we held the channel open and waited for the lightspeed delay to run its course. 12 minutes after we lit up, the Vaethari diplomatic element would receive our sensor ping and our visual return simultaneously. Approximately 2 minutes after that, depending on the speed of their command chain and the processing load on their translation systems, they would decode our message. And then we would learn something about the Vaethari Conclave that 3,000 years of documented contact protocol could not tell us with certainty. What they did when a situation exceeded the parameters of their preparation. The command deck was quiet. Irevan stood at the tactical display and watched the plot. The sensor team ran their checks. I kept my hands on my console and watched the Vaethari element on the passive arrays, watching for any change in their emission profile that would tell me something was happening before the lightspeed delay allowed us to see what. The 4 hours of approach were not uneventful, though they were not dramatic in the way that afterward you might expect. What happened in those 4 hours was a kind of sustained, careful attention. The whole ship attending to a situation that was unfolding faster than anyone had planned for, and more slowly than the tension in that room wanted. At 40 minutes into the approach, Halst flagged an intercept on the secondary passive array. The survey elements had opened an internal communications channel among themselves, not encrypted, or rather, encrypted to a standard that our package had a partial key for. We caught fragments, enough fragments to understand that the survey elements were comparing sensor records, trying to reconcile what they had seen with what they expected to see. One fragment translated cleanly, query, repeated across 3 survey vessels in slightly different phrasing each time, which suggested different operators asking the same question independently. Our translation system rendered the consensus version as, "Where was this object 31 days ago?" They were asking the right question. They did not have the answer. Another fragment, 20 minutes later, the 7 survey element commanders were attempting to calculate backwards from our current emissions profile to determine what our passive signature would have looked like at minimal power. They were trying to figure out whether we could have been hiding in the nebula. The conclusion, as best our partial decryption could determine, was inconclusive. The nebula's own emissions were too broad spectrum to rule it out, but they could not confirm it either. They were in the uncomfortable position of not knowing whether they had missed something fundamental or whether something genuinely impossible had just appeared. At 1 hour and 10 minutes, Commander Irevan came back to CIC. She did not usually spend long stretches at my station. She worked from the command deck at the tactical display, and she came to CIC when she wanted something specific. She stood next to my console and looked at the passive array feed for a moment without speaking. Then she said, quietly, "Give me a mass estimate, best figure you can generate from what their sensors are currently putting out." I ran the numbers. The Vaethari survey elements had been pinging us with active sensors for over an hour at this point, and their return data, the echo we could see from our own passive arrays, gave us a reasonable reconstruction of their picture. If their gravity sensor technology is consistent with the 2231 intercepts, I said, they have a mass estimate of roughly 1.2 to 1.6 million tons. The range is wide because the nebula is adding noise to their passive readings, but the lower bound alone puts us at 20 times the heaviest vessel in their contact catalog. Irevan looked at the display. They're going to transmit that figure to the Central Council. They already have, I'd guess. They've been sending burst traffic on the long-range diplomatic band every 40 minutes since we lit up. Regular intervals, not reactive. No, that's their reporting cadence. Procedural. Whatever they're feeling about what they're seeing, their reporting procedure hasn't changed. Irevan was quiet for a moment. That tells you something. It tells me their procedures are robust, I said, or that whoever is running their delegation has good discipline. Same thing after 3,000 years. She looked at the approach plot. When we stop at 800 meters, what is their crew going to see on a direct visual? I thought about it. At 800 meters on a clear visual, the full length of our hull from bow to amidships will be too close for them to frame the whole ship in one field of view without a very wide angle. They'll see the forward gun arrays in detail, the sensor dome, the armor plating on the bow section, which took 2 hits in the current engagement and was patched but not cosmetically repaired, the char marks forward of gun mount 3. So they'll see a ship that has been in combat. Yes, and chose not to be here. And chose not to be here, I agreed. She nodded once. Good, she said, and went back to the command deck. I turned that exchange over in my head for a while. The Ardent Silence was not a new ship. Her scars were real. A hull that had absorbed fire and continued to function was a different message than a pristine hull. It said that the thing you were looking at had been tested and was still here, which was a statement about endurance that transcended language. You did not need a translator to read it. On the main deck I could hear, through the CIC intercom, the steady background of a crew going about their work, not the compressed alertness of battle stations, something more measured than that. Checks being run, positions being confirmed, people talking in the ordinary tones that professional people use when they are doing something they have trained for and the training is holding. There was no drama in it. The Ardent Silence did not do drama well. It was not built for that register. It was built for endurance and precision, and the willingness to hold a position under any conditions for as long as the job required. I found that steadying, sitting in CIC with the approach clock counting down. At 1 hour and 50 minutes into the approach, the first intercept from the diplomatic vessels themselves came through. Less fragmentary than the survey element traffic, the diplomatic vessels had more communications antenna bandwidth and were talking more. The key exchange, translated. Query from the lead diplomatic vessel to the other 2. Is there a contact protocol for this situation? Response from the second vessel, reviewing archive now. Response from the third vessel, no precedent in documented records. The lead vessel again, confirmed no precedent. Second and third vessels in sequence, confirmed. Irevan was reading the intercepts on the secondary feed at her station. She said, to no one in particular, they're checking the rule book. The captain said, and there isn't a rule. Orev said nothing. She watched the approach plot. At 2 hours and 41 minutes, when we were close enough that their full-resolution sensors would have been giving them everything. Hull configuration, weapons array placement, armor thickness, the exact dimensions of our drive nacelles, the thermal bloom pattern of our reactor systems, all of it. A signal came in on the diplomatic band. It was not addressed to the probe. It was addressed to the vessel. I read the translation and did not speak for approximately 3 seconds. Then I said, Captain, I have a message from the Vaethari Conclave diplomatic delegation. It is addressed directly to the Ardent Silence. Captain Orev was already walking toward my station. Read it. I read it aloud. We have received your message stating that you were present for the full duration of our contact protocol and chose not to be seen. We have analyzed your vessel. We have no record of a vessel of your class or your mass in any of our contact histories. We note that your platform, which we correctly assessed as non-armed and non-propulsive, is not the extent of your presence. We have been conducting first contact with a species for 11 days. We are now prepared to acknowledge that we have been conducting that contact incorrectly. We ask the following question: why did you choose to reveal yourself now, at this moment, rather than at the beginning of our contact? Captain Orev stood at my station and looked at the translation for a moment. Then she said, "Voss, transmit the following." I opened the channel. She dictated, "Because we wanted you to know us by what we sent before you knew us by what we are. The message came first. The messenger waited. We believe you would have made the same choice." I transmitted it. The lightspeed delay was, by now, manageable. We had closed to a little over 1 light minute. Roughly 60 seconds for our signal to reach them, 60 seconds for their response to reach us. 2 minutes at best, plus whatever processing time their translation system needed. The response came back in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. We would have made the same choice. There was nothing after that for a time. The ardent silence continued on her approach vector. The Vaethari diplomatic vessels held position. The survey elements, which had been maintaining their wide observation geometry, slowly, very slowly, over a period of about 20 minutes, began to ease back toward a tighter configuration around the diplomatic element. Not a defensive posture, a settled one. At 3 hours and 49 minutes after we first lit up, the ardent silence came to rest at 812 meters off the port bow of the Vaethari lead diplomatic vessel. At 800 meters, on a visual feed from our forward optical array, the lead vessel was visible as something more than a sensor return. It was long and narrow, built on a structural logic that I did not initially understand, and then, over the course of several minutes of looking at it, began to. The Vaethari were a species that had evolved in a low-gravity environment, and their ships were built the way low-gravity architecture tends to build itself, extending upward and outward from a central spine rather than compressing inward, with structures along the hull that looked like fins or wings, and were, I suspected, heat management systems optimized for a thermal balance equation different from ours. The ship's hull was a pale gray that caught the ambient light of the nebula and held it, which gave the whole vessel a faint luminescence that made it look, at this distance, like something carved from cold light. It was 312 meters long. It was, in every way that a ship can express the intentions of its builders, a ship designed to travel and to communicate and to last. It was not designed for violence. It had no weapons array emplacements, no ablative armor on the leading surfaces, no point defense mounts. It had the sensor suite of a vessel that wanted to know everything about its environment, and the drive systems of a vessel built for endurance over speed, and the communications arrays of a vessel whose primary purpose was to talk. I looked at it for a long time. At 800 meters, our hull was, in some sense, all they could see. We blocked their view of most of the nebula. We were larger than anything in their catalog by a factor that their computers had been calculating for the past several hours, and at 800 meters they could count our gun mounts. We had 14 of them, forward and aft, in 3 calibers, and all 14 were cold and pointed nowhere in particular. We had not trained a single weapon on them. I had the feeling, and it was only a feeling, not a certainty, that they were looking at our cold gun mounts with a great deal of interest. A species that has gun mounts and does not use them is sending a message, the same message the probe had sent. We have this. We are choosing not to use it. At 11 minutes and 40 seconds after we lit up, I had been tracking the light speed delay to the second. I got something on the passive arrays that I had not expected. Every one of the 7 survey elements went simultaneously dark. Not their drives, not their reactor signatures, their communications and active sensor emissions. All of it, all 7 vessels at the same moment dropping to 0. The diplomatic vessels did the same thing 1 second later. For 11 seconds I counted them. The entire Vaethari element was electronically silent. Then everything came back. I had been in this work long enough to understand what that silence meant. The Vaethari Conclave's contact protocol was documented and followed. It was the result of 3,000 years of institutional practice. There was a procedure for every situation they had encountered, refined over hundreds of first contacts, stress-tested by time. Those 11 seconds were not shock. They were not panic. They were a moment of organizational stillness, the kind that happens when an institution encounters a data point that falls entirely outside the parameters its procedures were designed to address, and the institution's collective processing power is briefly diverted from ongoing operations to the single question of how to categorize what it is seeing. Those 11 seconds were the sound of 3,000 years of careful documentation, meeting something that the documentation had not anticipated. I noted the duration in the contact log, 11 seconds. It did not seem like much written down. It was the most significant thing I recorded that day. The diplomatic channel opened again. We would like to propose a formal contact schedule. We are authorized to negotiate on behalf of the Vaethari Conclave in all matters pertaining to initial contact and preliminary treaty framework. We have transmitted this contact record to the Conclave's Central Council. We expect their formal authorization for expanded talks within 40 Vaethari rotational periods. We ask that you remain at your current position for the duration of this contact. Captain Orev looked at me. I looked at the captain. She said, transmit the following. We accept. We will remain. We ask one question in return. How many of the species in your contact catalog sent a message before they sent a ship? The response took 8 minutes, longer than the light speed delay warranted. Someone was looking something up. None, you are the first. Orev sat down in her chair. For a long moment, the command deck was quiet. Not the tense quiet of the preceding hours, not the quiet of people holding their breath and waiting to learn whether they had made a mistake. A different quiet. The kind of quiet that settles into a space when something has been decided and everyone present knows it. I kept my eyes on my displays and let it sit. What followed, and this is the part that takes longer to explain than people expect, because they want the big moment to be a single moment, was 12 days. 12 days during which the ardent silence and the Vaethari diplomatic element maintained their positions at 800 meters, and during which a contact schedule was negotiated at the speed of light-minute lag, and during which the Conclave's Central Council transmitted their formal authorization, and during which the protocol for a first substantive exchange was agreed upon, item by item, with a precision that reflected 3,000 years of the Conclave's accumulated experience and the particular care that humanity had been developing for this moment for the better part of a century. I will not describe all 12 days. They were, in the texture of their daily experience, remarkably similar to one another. A lot of transmission and decoding and cross-referencing, and the particular fatigue of working with a language that is not your own, and is not quite like any language your translation system was originally built for. My team worked in 8-hour rotations and ate at our stations more often than we ate in the mess, and the coffee remained bad. These are the honest details. There was one day, the 5th, that I will describe, because it illustrates something about what those 12 days actually were. On the 5th day, we hit a translation impasse. The Vaethari contact schedule had progressed to the point where both sides were attempting to agree on a framework for the substantive talks that would follow, a meta-document, essentially, establishing what topics could be raised, in what order, and with what degree of formal obligation attached to any agreements reached. This is the kind of document that looks, on the surface, like a procedural formality, and is actually the ground on which everything that follows is built. The impasse was over a single term. Our translation system had been rendering it, across multiple contexts, as obligation or commitment, and we had been reading it as a legal concept, a binding undertaking. But the Vaethari use of the term did not map cleanly onto that reading. In some contexts, it appeared in documents that were clearly non-binding. In others, it appeared in documents that were clearly binding. When I ran a broader corpus search across everything in the contact archive, I found the term used in contexts that spanned what our legal framework would classify as treaty, intention, courtesy, and ceremony. I spent 4 hours on it. Then I brought it to Commander Irevan with a 1-page summary. The term, I told her, was probably best understood as a statement of attentional commitment, an expression that the party using it was directing their full institutional focus toward the matter in question, and regarding it as worthy of that focus. It did not automatically mean binding agreement. It meant something closer to, we are taking this seriously, and you can hold us to that seriousness as a standard. Irevan read the summary. Then she said, so when they use that term in the framework document, they're not promising to do anything. They're promising to mean it when they try. Roughly, I said. It's more nuanced than that, but roughly. She thought for a moment. That's actually a more honest framework than a binding obligation. I had not thought of it in those terms, but she was right. A binding obligation tells you what a party will do. A statement of attentional commitment tells you something about what they are. The Vaethari were not offering us a contractual guarantee. They were offering us something closer to a declaration of character. We translated the term as sincere engagement in the final document. The Vaethari delegation, when they received that rendering, replied with what our system assessed as a term of agreement, but specifically the term they used for agreement between parties who have understood each other correctly. Not just yes. Correctly understood and yes. I logged that exchange as a footnote in the contact record. It is the kind of thing that does not make the summary briefings, but that I think matters more, in the long run, than anything that goes in the summary briefings. The work itself was technical and precise, and occasionally fascinating in the way that difficult translation is fascinating. The moments when a concept from one language resolves cleanly into an equivalent in another, and you understand that two very different things have arrived at the same idea by very different routes. The Vaethari had a term in their diplomatic vocabulary that our system initially rendered as patience with expectation, and then, after several days of contextual analysis, revised to something closer to deliberate restraint toward a known outcome. It was a word they used a lot in their internal communications during those 12 days. We came to understand it as a term of approval. On the 8th day, the Vaethari diplomatic delegation transmitted a document. It was not part of the negotiated schedule. It was, our translation system assessed after some difficulty, something closer to a voluntary disclosure, an item they had chosen to share without being asked. It was a record. Specifically, it was a summary of the Conclave's assessment file on humanity, the catalog entry they had assembled from 3 decades of passive observation before this contact began. Their assessment of us was thorough. It noted our system of origin, our approximate population, our technological development as of the date of their most recent observation. It noted our drive technology and our communications infrastructure and the industrial output of our manufacturing base. It noted, accurately, our orbital defense network and our fleet composition in broad terms. The document was sober, well organized, and reflected a quality of analysis that I would have been comfortable putting my name on if it had been written from our side about them. And at the bottom of the document, in the section their format reserved for qualitative assessments, the kind of characterization that carried no numbers and no measurements, there was a single entry. Our translation system rendered it as capability substantially greater than posture suggests. Posture appears deliberate, motivation unclear. I read that and sat with it for a moment. They had known. Not what we were precisely, not the ardent silence's exact specifications, but that our posture and our capability were not the same thing. They had been watching us for 30 years, and they had reached the conclusion that we were showing them less than we had. They had come to this first contact already knowing that the probe was not the whole picture, and they had followed their protocol anyway. They had sent the message to the probe, and waited and conducted their inspection, and sent their delegation, all of it, while carrying the quiet knowledge that they might not be seeing everything. That was what those 11 seconds of silence had been, not shock at a vessel appearing from nowhere. Confirmation of a hypothesis they had already formed, arriving at a scale that their hypothesis had not quite predicted. They had suspected something was behind the probe. They had not expected something our size. I thought about that for the rest of the 8th day and into the 9th. We had been trying to show them, through the sequence of message first and ship second, that we understood the difference between what you are and how you choose to present yourself at a first meeting. We had not known that they already suspected the gap. We had been demonstrating a principle they had already inferred. Two parties, each concluding independently that the other was being careful about the same thing. There is a word for that in some of the older diplomatic literature: mutual legibility, two different kinds of caution recognizing each other across a distance. On the 12th day, the ardent silence and the Vaethari diplomatic element concluded the preliminary contact framework. It was not a treaty. It was an agreement to proceed toward treaty talks, to be conducted at a location to be determined, with delegations from both sides, over a timetable that both sides agreed was appropriately unhurried. The agreement was, in the conclave's framing, a statement that both parties regarded the other as a party worth talking to. That was what it was, and it was not nothing. The last exchange before the diplomatic element prepared to depart was, per the contact schedule, a formal close, a reciprocal statement of intent, standard form, drafted in consultation and transmitted simultaneously by both parties. And then, after the formal close, the Vaethari lead diplomatic vessel transmitted something off schedule. A single sentence, not formatted as a diplomatic communication. Formatted, our system assessed, as something like a personal remark. The kind of thing a diplomat puts at the bottom of a message when they want it understood as their own view rather than their institution's. We look forward to learning what else you have not yet chosen to show us. Captain Orav read it and looked at me, and I looked at the captain, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then she said, "Transmit this, so do we." I transmitted it. The diplomatic element broke position cleanly. A controlled departure, no drama, drive emissions stepping up in a smooth curve, and the formation of vessels beginning their transit back toward the edge of the Kalen Rift. I watched them go on the passive arrays, tracking the emission signatures until they faded below the noise floor of the nebula, and then I watched the empty space where they had been for a while longer, the way you do sometimes when a significant thing has just moved away, and the space it leaves takes a moment to seem like ordinary space again. Halst said from his console, "Think they'll come back with a bigger delegation?" "Yes," I said. "Think we'll send a bigger ship?" I looked at the empty space on the passive display, and at the amber-gray smear of the nebula on the visual feed, and at the probe still sitting at 22,000 kilometers from where the diplomatic element had been, broadcasting its 40-minute loop into the dark. Primes, orbital mechanics, the spectral signature of our sun, the open palm. "We'll send the right ship," I said, "same as we did this time." Halls thought about that. What's the right ship? I did not have a clean answer for him. The right ship is the one the situation calls for. The right ship for a first meeting between two species that are both old enough to have learned the difference between capability and threat, between presence and aggression, between being seen and being understood. The right ship for that meeting is not the smallest thing you have, and it is not the largest. It is the thing that communicates, at the sensor level and the visual level simultaneously, that you are serious about this, without communicating that you regard seriousness as the same thing as menace. The ardent silence had been the right ship. Whether what came next would be something larger or something different, that was a decision above my pay grade and above my knowledge of the negotiating calendar. What I knew was that the framework we had built in 12 days was the kind of foundation that took 3,000 years of Vaethari practice to recognize as solid, and the kind that took humanity's particular quality of deliberate patience to lay correctly. Halst was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What do you think they'll say about us when they go back and report?" I thought about the qualitative assessment entry at the bottom of their catalog file. Capability substantially greater than posture suggests. Posture appears deliberate. Motivation unclear. That last line, motivation unclear, was the one I had spent the most time with. It was not a negative assessment. In the Vaethari framing, unclear motivation was not the same as suspicious motivation. Their word for it was closer to the concept of not yet fully mapped, an acknowledgement that a new entity had not yet revealed all of its reasons, which was not an accusation, simply an accurate description of where any first contact begins. We had given them a better picture of our capability today than they had 3 weeks ago. We had not yet given them a complete picture of our motivation. That was the work that remained. "I think they'll say we're worth knowing," I said, "and that knowing us will take time." Halst nodded. "That's not bad." "No," I said, "it's not bad at all." Captain Orev came into CIC a few minutes later. She did not usually spend time in CIC after a contact concluded. She had a report to write and a communications queue to clear, the administrative reality that sits underneath every significant event. But she stopped at my station and looked at the passive display for a moment, at the quiet nebula, at the probe, at the empty coordinates where the Vaethari delegation had been. "Good work today, Voss," she said. "Thank you, Captain." She looked at the display a moment longer. Then she went back to the command deck and she went back to work, which was the right thing to do, which is always the right thing to do when something significant has just happened, and the significant thing is done, and what is left is the ordinary work of carrying it forward. There is a thing that happens, I have found, when you have been part of a moment that everyone around you understands to be significant. You do not feel what you expected to feel. You expected something large and clear, the emotion that matches the weight of the event. What you get instead is the specific, ordinary tiredness of someone who has worked for 12 days straight and slept badly and eaten at their station more often than in the mess. And under that tiredness, something quieter and more durable than emotion. Something closer to a change in perspective that you have not yet fully processed. I understood, sitting at my station watching the empty space where the Vaethari diplomatic element had been, that the contact had changed both of us. Not in the way that a battle changes things, where the change is immediate and violent, and the scale of it is measurable in what is destroyed. In the way that the introduction of new information changes a model, quietly, at the level of the assumptions you didn't know you were making, shifting the framework inside which everything else sits. The Vaethari Conclave had come into this contact with a protocol refined over 3,000 years of experience. That protocol assumed that the entity making first contact presented itself in full, that what you saw was what you were dealing with, that the gap between the message and the messenger was a function of technological limitation rather than deliberate decision. We had not fit that assumption. We had broken it very gently, by simply being present and waiting and choosing the moment of our own disclosure. And in doing so, we had given them a new datum that their 3,000 years had never provided. A species that can choose to be unseen, and chooses instead to be seen on its own terms, at a moment of its own selection, is a species that understands something about the difference between capability and presence. That is not a small thing to learn about a new neighbor. And we had learned something too. We had learned that the Vaethari Conclave, an institution that had every reason to be confident in its own procedures, Every reason to regard a first contact as a situation it had handled before and could handle again had sat in the dark for those 11 seconds, not because it was overwhelmed, but because it was genuinely reassessing. Not panicking, not militarizing, reassessing, taking in a new piece of information and updating the model. 3,000 years old and still capable of updating the model. That is not a small thing to learn about a potential partner. The ardent silence held position for another 6 hours after the diplomatic element departed, standard post-contact protocol, allowing time for any delayed communication, any secondary element arriving to continue the contact or to observe the outcome. Nothing came. The space of the Kalen rift was quiet in the particular way that it had been quiet before all of this, the nebula giving back its steady faint static on every passive array and nothing else. Captain Orev ordered us to stand down from contact posture and set a course back toward Terran space. I logged the end of the contact in the record. Time, date, outcome. I wrote the notation that would go in the intelligence file. First substantive contact with the Vaethari Conclave achieved. Preliminary contact framework signed. Recommendation: treaty talks proceed on the agreed timetable. Then I wrote below that, in the section reserved for the observing specialist's personal assessment, a section that not every analyst fills in but that I have always regarded as the most honest part of the record. Both parties left this contact with a more accurate picture of the other than either had at the start. That is not always the outcome. It is, I think, the only outcome worth having. I saved the record and closed the log. Outside the passive arrays, the Kalen rift burned in its slow and ancient way, amber and gray-blue, indifferent to all of it. The ardent silence pointed her bow toward home, and we went.